Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I am Caitlin Whaley, MSBA Senior Director of Advocacy, and I'm joined today by Linda Quinley, the MSBA Senior Director of School Finance and Member Services, to talk about something that I think has been on all of our minds for the last few months.
Probably one of the most interesting topics there is right now.
Absolutely. You know, I joke that I didn't get into policy to talk about taxes, but yet here I am.
It's what we like to talk about.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you again for joining us today to talk about Senate Bill 3 and then have a bigger conversation just around how do we talk about property taxes and the value that property taxes bring to communities as it relates to education. So just to kind of kick us off, let's talk about what is Senate Bill 3. So Senate Bill 3 is a piece of legislation that was passed in a special session by the legislature last year, and it talks about three main areas. So the first was stadium funding. So this was an incentive package to try and keep the Chiefs and Royals in Missouri. The second was a disaster tax credit to help with recovery efforts in St. Louis after the May tornado last year. And then the third, what we're really going to focus on today, was a property tax cap for counties and taxing jurisdictions. And that, like I said, that's really going to be the central focus of today. So property tax by county. There were three different types, well, two different caps, three different categories of counties in the bill. So the first is 5% counties, and there were 77 counties that fell into this category. And these would be counties where your property tax assessment growth would be capped at 5% or inflation, whichever is greater. The second group is 0% counties. So these counties would not be allowed to have any growth. And then the third are no change counties, which would be counties that it's status quo. And these are in this bucket are some of our largest counties like Jackson County, St. Louis County, Boone County. And this is a map for you to see what those counties are. So you might already be familiar with what designation your county had, and you might be asking yourself, who came up with this map? How did we decide what counties were going to be what? And the answer is it came down to your senator. As they were negotiating this package, the senators were asked what sort of category they wanted their counties within their districts to fall into. A number of them, I will say, my understanding is reached out to county officials to ask county officials what they wanted and then passed that along. And so that's why there are some counties where two counties represented by the same senator might have a different designation. But you can see there are like I mentioned, some of our larger counties like Jackson, Clay, Boone, St. Louis City, St. Louis County, Greene County. And then there are quite a few counties that are that 5% cap. And then there are still a significant number of counties that are the purple, which are the 0% counties that are no growth counties.
Caitlin, I had a question about that.
Yeah.
So my state senator, I asked about that. So I live in Howard County, which is the gray in the center, the highest gray one in the center, and he represents those counties over to the west, which are not gray,
Yep.
right? So I live in this no change county, and I asked him why we were different, and he said it was because of the fact that we had not implemented Senate Bill 190, and so it felt to him like our little county was okay with the property tax structure it was. But my question is, do they ever have the ability to change that? Or is it solely now based on this election, the way the bill's written? Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, that's okay. So you're asking if they could change what bucket that they fell into.
Right.
I think they would have to go back to the law is the
Okay.
answer, because while the counties are not named, because you can't name specific
Right, they are
counties in
described.
the law, they use demographic information and geographic information to really specifically describe which counties fell into which category. So in order to change a designation, they would have to go back in and move what designation that county description fell under.
Someone asked me that, and I should have known to think of that answer, but I didn't.
That's okay. That's a good question. So, we've hit on the what is the property tax. So let's talk a little bit about why, what they were trying to get at. So property taxes has been a hot topic of conversation in the legislature for the last couple of years. A lot of that stems from individual senators and constituents in their district expressing frustration about the property tax process. Some of it, the feedback is not even specific to the property tax rate. A lot of it is about the property tax structure and filing appeals. I know there's been a lot of controversy in Jackson County, for example, about property taxes. But the idea is to offer homeowners relief from property tax bills on their primary residence. So you can only it's only your primary residence. This doesn't apply to like rental properties and stuff like that. As I mentioned, it was determined by each individual senator. And the baseline year is 2024. And then the ballot is let me back up. So the way this is theoretically legal, it's laid out to mirror the mechanisms they used in Senate Bill 190, which is you can't cut local revenue without replacing it at the state level. And the way they've gotten around that is putting these things on local ballots. So each county would be asked to vote on if they want to implement this cap. So it isn't just a cap that's implemented by the legislature, it's a county vote. And so that brings us to when is it going to be voted on, which is in April in theory. And I will get to
we'll talk more about that.
I will get to the in theory part in a second, but in theory, it has to be voted on in the April election, which is this coming April of 2026, and then an implementation date in the fall of 2026. And then you have to report on the county has to report to the taxing jurisdiction on the credits applicable in November. So the county is mandated to put this on the ballot by April, and it is, Linda, this is getting into some mechanics of property taxes. You might have to tap in and help me with.
I will help.
But it's essentially, I'm not even going to try, Linda. You try. You explain how this is going to work.
So basically, the question is going to be, shall we allow this property tax credit, which means you'll get the full normal bill, and then you'll get a credit against that bill that will reduce the amount of money that goes to school, reduce the amount of money you pay. So it will serve as a credit versus an overall reduction of the rate that people pay.
So,
and what I think is so interesting about that, a lot of people are thinking about this is impacting the taxing jurisdiction, but the county is the one who has to put it on the ballot.
Right.
So it's not the taxing jurisdiction's responsibility, even though the taxing jurisdictions are the ones impacted by the result of the election.
Absolutely. And it's not just schools that are impacted by the results of these elections. While schools might be a large recipient of property taxes, we are certainly not the only recipient of property taxes. So this kind of brings up a question about the Hancock Amendment. So this really comes into play as it relates to rolling back levies and how counties use how counties calculate the amount of levies based on the value of homes in their area. And this aggregate value has been something that they've talked about extensively in the legislature because there's a misconception sometimes that each individual homeowner is protected from impacts exceeding a certain level, but really it's about the aggregate level at the county.
Right. And so when we think about how we do the Hancock Amendment calculation each year, it is very specific to allow the levy of the district or any other taxing jurisdiction, we're going to talk about the districts today, but we know it's all of them, to either roll up or back their levy based on the allowable amount of new revenue. So that is important for us to keep our eye on. Hancock is already doing that. It's managing the amount of new revenue we can take each year based on the lesser of 5%, CPI, or actual assessed valuation. We don't very often hit the 5% because normally CPI or the actual change in AV is the lower, but basically Hancock says you could never get more than 5% because it's the lesser of those three things. And as you mentioned, it does use that aggregate value, all the properties in the county, but this bill, then goes behind that and says, but this house, because it's eligible, is limited, and this house, because it's eligible, is limited. So we cap for Hancock on aggregate, and then individual tax credit bills are given after that, which is really what makes it kind of a duplicative whammy to us and our other taxing jurisdictions, and will result in tax revenues that are considerably less in growth than they've been in the past. But let's talk about the 0% to kind of help drive this home. Because 0%, if we can't grow the total revenue at all, which means, I won't make up numbers because then I'll do the math poorly in my head, so I won't do that. So let's say we get our total assessed valuation and it is more this year than it was last year, theoretically our levy's going to roll back, because we're only allowed so much growth. So maybe our levy rolls back a little bit because our assessed valuation grew, but then after that levy's set, we go in and we give these tax credits. So it is probable that a 0% county would actually end up with negative revenue. Instead of limited growth, they might actually lose some revenue and go backwards in their revenue. So we always have to remember that in public ed, we get our new money every year to give steps on salary schedules, to improve our base pay, to be able to afford the rising cost of food and those kinds of things. That's what we use to do those things with. And if we're limiting that new revenue and or reducing it, it's going to be really tight for our school districts.
Yeah.
I think I'll chat about this one too, so let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Potential negative revenues, that's a big thing. This bill could actually result in negative revenues for the 0. And where you're capped at 5, it'll have that same impact. You probably won't actually collect 5. You'll collect something less than 5% growth. So we have to really be thinking about the long-term implications. In year 1, it may not be huge. I was working with a school district yesterday that said just based on how their community has worked to attract retiring families, 25% of the homes in their boundaries have been impacted by Senate Bill 190. That is huge for their ability to grow revenue.
Yeah.
So here's another layer on top of that that caps and limits our ability to have new revenue to do new things with. So we have to always remind our taxpayers and our property owners in our community how important that local revenue is to us. So think about trying to keep up with Senate Bill 727 and the new minimum wage bill on compensation to keep up with the rising cost of doing business with less new revenue each year. And that's really kind of my mantra on all of these tax capping bills. And then long term, it's going to really make it difficult to keep that fund balance where it needs to be without you every year having to pinch pennies and make some changes. So potentially this has really long-term future implications that'll be hard on us. And debt service, right now, it's not clearly carved out. Am I right about that?
Correct.
That's okay. It's not clearly carved out that debt service doesn't apply also. When you go to voters to pass a GO bond and a debt service levy is created, it's created to meet the principal and interest demands of that GO bond over its 20-year life, with assumptions built in. Let's say you have debt on the books that's been on the books 5 years. Interest rates were a little higher then. Well, actually, they were a little lower, but let's assume that you had higher interest rates that have made us make some assumptions, and assessed valuation was growing. We've made other assumptions, and now all of a sudden these tax capping bills come in, and we're not able to charge the amount of levy we had been. We may not be able to repay the principal and interest on the debt we already have on the books. And if you're going to add new debt, you're probably going to have to ask for a higher levy to do it, because you're going to have to manage the fact that you've got this limitation on new revenue. So debt service is a real concern, short-term and long-term.
So, yeah, I think setting aside the financial implications, the administrative side of this, and asking districts to manage their day-to-day, their year-to-year financial health is going to be that much more challenging, because it's going to be less money and it's going to be more unpredictable.
Absolutely.
And that's on top of all the other layers of, financial unpredictability, I think, that we're seeing districts forced to navigate at present.
Yeah, we're in the most unpredictable, unreliable revenue time that we've ever been in, with mandated rising costs. So it's going to be complicated.
Well, and this is not the focus of today, but I would be remiss in not mentioning, the broader conversations that are happening about the foundation formula,
right,
and even outside of Senate Bill 3, looking at eliminating the income tax and somehow rolling up changes to property tax in that effort. And I've been, watching closely. You've been engaged on that foundation formula task force. And the question has been asked, is there a different source of local revenue we can look towards? And one thing, setting aside this, you can say about property taxes is it is a more stable tax. When they're looking
Right.
at a tax on services or a tax on goods, those are very unstable. You see
Absolutely.
economic downturn and you can see huge fluctuations in your tax revenue, whereas property taxes, you can kind of predict year over year what that's going to look like.
And that's what schools have leaned into when they're budgeting. It's been reliable. Our trends have been reliable and they've been trackable. They are going to be very unreliable and less trackable going forward. So creating those assumptions that leaders have to create about what our new revenue rates and assumptions will be is exactly because of that. It's going to be harder work than we've ever had.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the status of Senate Bill 3, because this was almost immediately challenged in court. There are two main lawsuits that were issued against this one. So the first one was filed by Senator Moon, Representative Wolfen, and then Ron Calzone, who is a private citizen. And that challenge was basically filed with the request to throw out the whole law. Both of the legislators that are named in this lawsuit felt that it exceeded the initial kind of call, and it was outside the scope of legislative authority, essentially to pass the law. That lawsuit actually got thrown out last week by the courts, so that one is no longer active. But the second lawsuit, that Kirchhofer versus the state of Missouri, is active, and it is moving. We are tracking updates on that. Even today, there's a hearing at 1:30. So just to kind of give everyone, and this I think is a really important thing that we're tracking and that everyone should keep an eye on. So there's a hearing today at 1:30 on a preliminary injunction. The question that they're looking to answer right now is, should an April election happen? The law, like we said, mandates that there is an April election, but there have been requests filed by the plaintiffs to issue an injunction against holding the April election, and we're waiting to see what the court will rule on that question.
Do we know when they will rule?
So like I mentioned, there's a hearing today. The judge that currently has it in front of him, Judge Limbaugh, has said he will issue a ruling before February 10th. February 10th is a critical date because that is when local election authorities have to certify the ballot for the April election. So he has promised to rule before February 10th. In talking with some of our attorneys, we're assuming that whatever ruling he issues will be appealed. So the thought might be we get a ruling from him sooner than that, but still have to go through either the Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court to get that final answer on whether or not it's going to go on the April ballot. But probably not. We probably won't have an answer today because they just have a hearing
Right.
on that preliminary injunction today. But I mean, it's moving fast and furious. They've added, there have been additional plaintiffs that have moved to intervene, and just there's filings flying minute by minute on that case.
I can only imagine what that's like. And, it's interesting to me that Al Kirchhofer started that as a citizen, as also a school CFO. I'm glad that one has stayed in it. But what happens if it doesn't end up on this April ballot? We wait and see what the ruling says?
Yeah, so I think it's just a wait and see game as far as what is the court's what type of action does the court say, because there's the current question of should it or should it not be on the April ballot, which sets aside the underlying question of the lawsuit, which is the law constitutional. So the plaintiffs, their main contention in their lawsuit is that this law is basically arbitrary and capricious. It doesn't have, there's not logical reasoning behind
Choosing the counties.
Right. There's not uniform taxation across citizens. So that's kind of the underlying question of the lawsuit. And then you have these filings that are seeking to kind of deal with the minutia of what happens. So there are multiple levels of this. The first kind of question incoming is it going to be on the April ballot? And then the other question is if it goes on the April ballot or if it doesn't go on the April ballot, is the underlying law constitutional? So even if they say it's not going to go in April, that doesn't mean it couldn't end up on a subsequent ballot. I'm not, since the law says April, I'm not really sure. I'm not a lawyer.
Oh, we do like to play it.
Yes, I do. But we're not really sure how that will kind of matriculate through the courts. But we will be providing updates as that comes out. And should it end up ruling that it is going to go forward on the April ballot, that doesn't mean it's going to go into effect. They could still let it go on the April ballot and then ultimately decide to throw out the results of the election if they rule that the underlying law is unconstitutional. I will say that we hope to distribute additional resources if the ruling is that it's going to go on the April ballot, some educational resources that districts can use in communicating with their communities. But in order to prevent some confusion, we're waiting to see whether or not that is actually going to go on the ballot.
So in the next 2 weeks, we'll know.
Yes, absolutely. And that really transitions into the next thing, and what I'm passionate about is how do you talk to your communities, not just about Senate Bill 3, but about property taxes in general, because it's not like the most thrilling conversation sometimes to try and get into the nitty-gritty with your local communities about property taxes.
It's actually a difficult conversation. We've become so tax averse in Missouri and across the country. So it's become more difficult to have the conversation in the most important time for us to have the conversation.
Yes, absolutely. And we are, I know our districts are grappling with this, but county governments, local municipalities are also trying to navigate how do we have this conversation, because while nobody likes paying taxes, the services and things that local governments deliver with these taxes are critical services. They're your schools, your libraries, your ambulances, your fire departments, your police departments, and so it's really an important time to be talking about what those services pay for and the good things that come out of those services. So a couple of things to keep in mind as someone who has really passionate about effective communication, put it in real terms.
Right.
Make it local. Don't talk broadly about whether or not property taxes are good or bad. Talk about why it matters to your district. Talk about real dollar impacts on what this would mean. Does it mean you wouldn't be able to hire that new kindergarten teacher? Does it mean you're going to have to cut an extracurricular? Put it in real dollars and then equate those real dollars to services that you're delivering.
I always love that when you're going for a levy improvement or anything. Another note, particularly for our boards, administrators on the call, make sure that your board members know this, and board members on the call, make sure that you know this. Right now, just saying 62% of our budget is funded locally. Thank you for being the way that we get the majority of our revenue to support our school districts. I think it's very critical that people know how much the local burden is for public education. So just share that percentage.
Yeah, absolutely. Because Missouri is a highly local. So we are like 40 high 40s as far as state local revenue funded. Most states get a much higher share of their revenue from the state. And so, when we're talking about property tax impact in Missouri, it's extremely high when they're looking to change those because we are such a heavily local funded state.
Yeah, I think that's the one percentage board members need to be quoting right now.
Yep. Another great talking point when you're having these conversations is your community support for bonds and levies. Bonds and levies are things that your citizens have gone to the ballot and said, this is important to us, having quality schools, having safe schools. These are things that matter to us. And, we see incredibly high percentage pass rates of bonds and levies and incredibly high levels of support oftentimes on those bonds and levies. So knowing those numbers for your district and having those kind of top of mind is a really powerful talking point when you're relating property taxes as a broad concept to individual impact to a district.
The other thing I would add there is I learn more and more how people think every school gets 7145 from the state, that the amount of the state adequacy target is what schools are receiving per child. Leaders, make sure that you and your board members know of that 7145, which by the way is only 6,900 so far this year, what amount per pupil are you getting? For the most part, it's 4,000 and below. And so just being able to share that and say, we only get $3,800 per pupil under the state foundation formula, again, leaning into the reliance on local revenue.
Absolutely. Next point, and we've touched on this a little bit, but collaborate. Don't make yourself an island when it comes to these conversations.
Right.
Reach out to your county government, reach out to your fire department, reach out to other entities that are supported by property taxes, and facilitate community conversations with all of those groups about what types of goods and services those property taxes are providing for the community.
This is more appropriate than ever, right? Because everyone's going to be impacted the same on this one, so that's perfect advice.
And then the last one is have those conversations with your elected officials. We find more often than not in Jefferson City, they like their schools.
Right.
It's the broader concept that they seem to struggle with, but when you put them on the spot about support for districts or for school districts within their elected districts, you find a much higher degree of support.
Right.
And so saying, Representative or Senator, I want you to know, as a school district in your area that you represent, this will mean X, Y, Z in dollars and cents for your communities that you're elected to represent. And again, using those real impact terms, talking about past support for bonds and levies, and collaborating in that communication with other entities that are impacted. Use those first 3 bullet points to talk to your legislators about what that impact looks like, because you as local citizens have a much stronger voice with your elected officials than me, who's offering kind of that statewide perspective. And so I cannot overemphasize enough the importance of having these conversations with your elected officials, and really doing that sooner rather than later. It doesn't have to be related to a specific piece of legislation or related to Senate Bill 3. Just doing that educational work of what you're doing that's in your community, what those property taxes are paying for, celebrating the wins, because school districts are doing incredible work, and we need to raise that up as much as possible.
I think we have become it's been hard. The last few years have been so hard, and the work is hard, and we're struggling just to stay alive, that we've really gotten even less engaged with telling those good stories. So that's a great point. We've got to get back to talking about all those great things, and the citizens doing it is where the power is. So I'm on your train.
To do our due diligence. We want to make sure we cover with everybody the do's and don'ts should Senate Bill 3 go on the ballot. So you are welcome to talk about property taxes and do educational efforts in that space. There aren't limitations on that. But when it comes to advocacy as it relates to specific ballot initiatives, there are some limitations in official roles. As private citizens, not as a representative of the school board, not as a school administrator in your private capacity, you're certainly welcome to engage in all the, protected First Amendment activities. But in official capacities, there are some guardrails we need to stay between. So, make appearances on personal time. Don't use official district distribution methods, whether that be a website or a newsletter or email addresses, to distribute specific materials advocating one way or another. Educational materials, informational materials are okay. So, for example, the handout that we just showed on property taxes, that's not advocating for a specific vote for or against anything. It's just informational, so that's okay. As a board, you can adopt resolutions to take a position. And things, again, we shouldn't do. Don't use district resources. Don't use paid district time. Don't use contact information distributed or collected by the district to distribute those materials. And we have a more comprehensive do's and don'ts document that, again, we'll put in the chat for you and we'll make available at the end of the webinar. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't say check with your attorneys if you're going to do anything in this space, just to make sure that they're comfortable with whatever activities you might be wanting to do from a district or a board perspective.
We do have a question on that.
Yeah.
What about advocating during a board meeting?
I think the board can vote to take a position, and I would say having a discussion during the debate of whether or not the board should take a position or vote for a resolution would be natural. I think that's part of the capacity, that's part of your duty as a board. If you're going to, it would be natural to have that conversation in the context of, is the board going to adopt a resolution?
I think that's right. I'm glad you shared this, because we think about these rules when it's our item on the ballot, right? But we're not putting this on the ballot. So it's very important for us to know the rules are the same, really.
Yes.
It's just as if you had placed this on the ballot, and if you follow those rules, you're going to be okay.
Yep. Absolutely. So we've kind of touched on this, but just to reiterate, what are some things, what are some activities that you could engage in to talk to the public, to educate the public? We've taught you that the question just asked board meetings. That's a great opportunity to have those conversations broadly about property taxes or specifically about Senate Bill 3, PTA meetings, teachers unions, staff and leadership meetings. Again, those need to be, if you're talking in official on district time, it needs to be educational, not specific advocacy. You can host community forums, you can visit with community organizations, and then separately, you can have campaign committees, not the board, not the district. Campaign committees can be formed to do more tangible items like yard signs or arrange volunteers and host community forums. So there's a wide range of topics. It looks similar to the rules that would exist if you're trying to pass. I mean, it's the same as if you're trying to pass a bond or levy. Kind of those guardrails are the same on this issue.
And I wouldn't stand down at this point hoping that it's not on the April ballot. So you've got a February, March board meeting prior to election. Those are really your two board meeting opportunities, unless you do something special. I would hope that administrators are giving some education on this topic at the board meeting, talking about 62% of our budget is locally funded. We believe the 3 to 5 year implication of this, because we're a 0 county or a 5% county or whatever, is this. I would make sure that every chance you have between now and April election, you do that public education right during your board meetings.
Yeah, absolutely. Whether or not it's on the April ballot, the conversations about what to do on property taxes is ongoing.
Right.
Even if we end up with Senate Bill 3 ruled unconstitutional by the court, I feel very confident in saying something is going to happen with property taxes in the next couple of years. And so we have to continue to stay on this topic. We have to continue to raise those educational efforts up and have those conversations in our community.
Yeah, it's become such the bad guy. Property taxes has become such the bad guy.
Yes.
But it's so critical to every public service in Missouri. So we do have to we've got to get back in the game of being willing to talk about property taxes, because we've all kind of shied away from it because it's such an unpopular conversation right now. So I think that's great advice. Let's just talk generally about all things property tax.
Just to kind of cover again, what are some things you can do right now? So as Linda mentioned, working with your school administrators to understanding your district's long-term impact, working on those community informational efforts, reaching out to other taxing jurisdictions in your area that are impacted. I really just want to say thank you so much. We had such a wonderful big group of people that joined us today that are interested in this topic. We encourage you to share this presentation with other members of your board or your administrative team that are interested in staying informed. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Linda.
Absolutely. We'll see you soon.
Have a great day, everybody.